When people think of George Washington, they usually imagine a heroic general, the first president of the United States, and the man often called the father of his country. But hidden beneath the statues, the dollar bills, and the history books is a very different story, one that's not so glamorous. Washington's teeth have become the stuff of legend. We've all heard the tale that he had wooden dentures, right? But the truth is far stranger, far more disturbing, and it tells us something shocking, not just about him, but about what life was really like in the 18th century. Because if you think dental care is painful today, imagine living in a time when people believed the tooth powder made from crushed bones or even gunpowder was the height of oral hygiene. Imagine a time when bathing was rare, bad breath was common, and doctors treated cavities by ripping out entire teeth. That's the world George Washington lived in, and his mouth was a battlefield. So today let's dig into the story of George Washington's teeth and uncover the shocking truth about 18th century hygiene. And trust me, once you hear what people really did back then, you'll never look at Washington's famous portraits the same way again. Washington's dental problems began early. As a young man in his 20s, he already suffered from severe toothaches, abscesses, and decay. In fact, by the time he became president in 1789, he had just one natural tooth left in his entire mouth. That's right, the man who gave stirring speeches to his troops, who met foreign dignitaries, and who led a new nation into being was doing it all while struggling with painful, awkward dentures that clacked when he talked and distorted the shape of his face. But here's where myth and reality collide. The popular story is that George Washington had wooden teeth. You've probably seen cartoons, jokes, maybe even learned it in school, but it's completely false. None of his dentures were made of wood. Instead, they were crafted out of much more unsettling materials. Ivory from hippopotamuses, teeth taken from cows, and, perhaps most disturbingly, teeth purchased from enslaved people. Records show that Washington bought human teeth from the enslaved individuals at Mount Vernon, paying them a small sum and then using those teeth to be fitted into his dentures. It's a chilling reminder that even in something as personal as dental care, the reality of slavery haunted everyday life. His dentures were mechanical contraptions, often made of ivory plates with springs that forced them open, meaning Washington had to strain his jaw muscles just to keep his mouth closed. They were uncomfortable, they didn't fit well, and they often caused him visible pain. Some portraits of Washington were even painted to make his jaw look fuller, hiding the way his face had sunken in from tooth loss. The great American hero we imagine speaking with authority often did so while grimacing through pain. But before we imagine Washington as uniquely unlucky, we need to understand that his dental misery wasn't unusual. In the 18th century, oral hygiene as we know it simply didn't exist. People didn't own toothbrushes the way we do today. Toothpaste, in the modern sense, wasn't invented yet. Instead, people used tooth powders, which could be made of crushed brick, charcoal, pumice, or even burnt bread. They'd rub it on their teeth with rags or sponges, thinking it would make their smiles whiter. In reality, many of these powders were so abrasive that they wore down enamel, leaving teeth even more vulnerable to decay. If your teeth hurt, you didn't have a dentist who could fill a cavity or perform a root canal. Dentistry as a profession was barely starting to exist. Most tooth pulling was done by barbers, blacksmiths, or traveling tooth drawers who set up in town squares, promising to rid you of your pain with a pair of pliers. Anesthesia didn't exist, so every tooth pulled was agony. People lived in fear of toothaches because they knew the cure would be almost as bad as the disease. This lack of care wasn't limited to teeth. Hygiene in the 18th century was, by our standards, shockingly poor. Bathing was rare. Many people believed washing too often could make you sick. The wealthy sometimes bathed in their large tubs, but even then, it wasn't a daily ritual. A bath might happen once a week, once a month, or even less often. Instead, people relied on changing their linen shirts, which absorb sweat and body oils, believing that was enough to stay clean. Deodorant didn't exist. Perfumes and powders were the main way to cover odors. Wigs, which were fashionable for men like Washington, weren't just about style, they were practical. People often shaved their heads to avoid lice infestations and then wore powdered wigs to give the appearance of dignity. The powder itself, usually made from starch, could be scented with lavender or orange to mask smells. But under those wigs, hygiene was another matter. Mouthwash as we know it didn't exist either, but people did have their own ways of freshening breath. Some chewed on herbs like mint, parsley, or cloves. Others rinsed with vinegar or alcohol. But bad breath was common, and tooth decay was a nearly universal problem. For the wealthy like Washington, there was access to early dentistry, but it was crude and experimental. He had dentures made by a dentist named John Greenwood, who crafted them using a mix of ivory, animal teeth, and human teeth. One of Greenwood's sets even used Washington's last surviving natural tooth as an anchor for the dentures. Greenwood begged Washington to keep that tooth as long as possible, because once it was gone, the dentures would fit even worse. Eventually, Washington lost that tooth too, and Greenwood had it mounted in a small gold locket, which he wore around his neck. Think about that. The president's tooth, preserved as a relic, dangling from his dentist's chain. But Washington's case opens a window into how 18th century society understood the body. Pain was normal, discomfort was accepted, and hygiene wasn't about prevention. It was about managing decay and smell as best as you could. People didn't expect to have all their teeth into old age. By the time someone reached their 40s or 50s, tooth loss was expected, even among the wealthy. For most people, dentures weren't even an option. They simply lived with gaps in their smiles, difficulty chewing, and chronic pain. So, what does this tell us about the 18th century? It tells us that hygiene was both radically different and disturbingly familiar. Different because the tools we take for granted, toothbrushes, toothpaste, dentists, were almost non-existent. But familiar because, just like today, people obsessed over appearances. They wanted white smiles. They wanted fresh breath. They just didn't have the science to achieve it. Washington himself tried everything available. He used tooth powders. He visited dentists. He endured painful procedures. But nothing could stop the steady march of decay. His letters are filled with complaints about aching gums and the struggle to eat. Even as president, he often had to pass up certain foods because his dentures made chewing impossible. Imagine hosting state dinners while barely able to eat the food yourself. That was Washington's reality. And the dentures themselves, while advanced for the time, were grotesque. They were heavy, clunky, and prone to breaking. Some used metal wires to hold the teeth in place. Others had springs that pushed them apart. Washington constantly needed repairs and adjustments. He traveled with multiple sets, just in case one broke. Far from being a symbol of dignity, they were a constant source of humiliation. But here's the shocking truth. Washington's bad teeth weren't just a personal struggle. They shaped his public image. Some historians believe his tight-lipped expression in portraits wasn't a sign of stern leadership, but simply his attempt to hide his dentures. His difficulty speaking may have influenced how he delivered speeches. Even his health and diet as president were affected by the state of his mouth. His teeth were a reminder that even the most powerful man in America was at the mercy of 18th century medicine. And if Washington suffered this much, imagine what life was like for the average person. Most people had no access to dentists at all. They endured pain until a tooth rotted away, or until they were desperate enough to have it yanked out by anyone with strong hands and a set of pliers. Toothaches could even be fatal, since infections from abscesses sometimes spread through the body. Beyond dental care, the rest of the 18th century hygiene was equally shocking. In cities, chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Sewage flowed openly. Bathhouses existed but were rare in America compared to Europe. In rural areas, people often washed only their hands and faces, leaving the rest of the body untouched for weeks at a time. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were common companions. Diseases like smallpox, dysentery, and typhus spread easily in these conditions. And yet, for all the filth, people still pursued fashion, elegance, and refinement. They powdered their wigs, scented their clothes, whitened their teeth with dangerous powders, and prided themselves on appearances. Hygiene was less about health and more about presentation. Washington, with his false teeth and powdered hair, was the perfect example. By the time Washington died in 1799, his dentures were infamous. Today, several sets still survive, preserved in museums. They are grim reminders of just how brutal early dentistry was. Looking at them, with their ivory plates, metal springs, and mismatched human and animal teeth, you can't help but cringe. But they also tell a larger story, the story of an era when medical science lagged far behind human ambition, when people wanted the dignity of a clean smile and a fresh appearance, but had almost no tools to achieve it. So, the next time you brush your teeth or sit in a dentist's chair, remember George Washington. Remember that the man on the dollar bill, the general who led America to independence, lived most of his life in constant dental pain. Remember that the myths about wooden teeth hide a darker, more complicated truth. And remember that in the 18th century, hygiene wasn't just about personal comfort. It was a battle against decay, disease, and the limits of medical knowledge. George Washington's teeth were not wooden. They were worse. And they are a symbol of just how shocking life could be in the 18th century, even for the most powerful man in the world. So, the next time you hear the legend, you'll know the reality. And maybe, just maybe, you'll appreciate your toothbrush a little more.